Okay, enough for introductions. Time to start working. I'm very proud to introduce our first speaker. She is here all the way from the United States. And the theme of this conference is connecting. So what's the best way to connect with your audience? To listen to them. It's as easy as that. But Janine Anderson works for Harkin in the United States. And Harkin means listen. And this organization specializes in public-powered journalism. So Janine is here to tell you all about it. Janine Anderson.
Hi. Oh, look, it works. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm really, really happy to be here and to see all of you. The very first time that I heard about the company that I now work for, I was sitting in seats similar to you, and somebody got up and talked about public-powered journalism. This was about 4.5 years ago, I think, and I sort of fell in love with it immediately and was like, I want to do that. And then I worked for a couple of years to get my newspaper to kind of buy into this, and then as soon as they had a job opening, I said, me please, and they hired me. So now I get to come here and talk with all of you about this way of making journalism and talking with and listening to your audiences, which is a pretty different way from what I was certainly used to in my career before joining Harkin. So, let me just make sure. So that's kind of my, ooh, there's some aliens. That's kind of my CV that shows a little bit of where I've been. I've spent most of my career at small to mid-sized daily newspapers and some hyperlocal outlets working in the print journalism and then online. So here we go. We're gonna just kind of, this is an outline of what we're going to do today. We've got the public-powered model that we're going to go through. There'll be time for some questions, and then depending on how much time we have left, I've got kind of a group exercise for us to go through on defining engagement, and then some discussion about how engagement works in your newsrooms and what you guys might want to be able to do differently. So if you guys could just maybe raise your hands for me, how many of you guys use comments either on your site or on Facebook? Just want to get an idea of how often you're getting that kind of engagement from your audience. How many of you like that? Good. How many of you find problems with it sometimes? Yay, see, this is a universal experience. So here's a nice little warning for you before we get started. I'm going to use some pretty big generalizations, so please, if there's anything that you see, you're like, but not me, this is some exaggeration maybe a little bit. So this is something that I've thought about a lot, and my notes aren't coming up, so I'm going to kind of go back here when I need to refresh my memory on what I need to make sure that I tell you guys here. So just give me 1 second to catch up. All right. So this is something that I think about a lot. So if you could just take a minute and think for yourselves about where you put your audience when you're doing your journalistic work. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about a different way that we have to treat your audience and what that might look like in your newsroom, what it looks like in other newsrooms. So just kind of note this for yourself now, and then we'll kind of talk about this again a little bit later. This is what the traditional journalism story cycle looks like. And normally, the public doesn't get the chance to give feedback on stories until after the reporting is done, after stories are published. And we think that's a little bit strange, because ultimately the public is what determines whether a story is relevant and what makes them popular. If you make a really great piece but nobody looks at it, it's not usually considered a very big success when you try to see whether something was strong with your audience. So the green line on the top is the newsroom, and the purple line on the bottom that goes up only after publication is what your audience gets to do within your normal news cycle, or production cycle. Oh, there we go. We got lots of builds here. Okay, so this is something that's true for me, and I don't know if that feels pretty true for you guys, but comments are kind of tricky. They can be difficult to manage, they're difficult to monitor sometimes, and you don't always get the most productive discussions going on in those threads, especially when there are people who disagree, that suddenly you've got angry people all over your comment thread. And we've seen a lot of people moving away from comments. These are some of the organizations in the United States that we've seen that have either killed comments altogether or only allow them sometimes. And even at smaller regional outlets, we're seeing this as well. The newspaper in my hometown, I think they've pretty much killed off comments on any story involving certain types of crimes, because the comment section after that just becomes horrible, and nobody can take the time to monitor that and moderate it. I'll just let you guys look at this one. So what's the problem with comments? They attract and amplify anger. When somebody's mad, and then it just gets bigger and bigger, and it's hard to kind of rein that in and bring it back under control once it gets started. Because if you think about what you do when you're angry about something or disagree with somebody, I know what I can do, and often I will dig in my heels, and I know that I'm right, and I know that they're wrong, and it's very difficult to have a really open and productive discussion once you've got that position going on. All reporters know that they need strong and thoughtful questions to get strong, thoughtful answers from their sources. So just imagine if you treated your sources like you treat your audience. This is what it would look like. You'd talk forever, and then you'd say, please comment on that, which is another way of saying, what do you think? It's a pretty weak and vague question, and that's where comment sections start. You present a lot of information, and then you give people a space to just sound off in some way with no real direction and no real, nobody guiding them to kind of get to where they should be or how something can be productive. And the other thing that you need to keep in mind when you're talking about comments is that most people don't even engage in that forum. It's not only that you're getting limited value from the public who are participating in comments, but you get no value from the people who decide to not participate at all. And I know for myself, I'm sometimes afraid to put a comment in because I don't want to have the nasty stuff that might come afterward. It's a big disincentive to a lot of people because they know where those things can go. And another important aspect of a comment section is not only that the public gets the chance to participate at the end, but when you put it on the page, it usually comes at the very bottom, at the end of all the other journalism. So you want to make sure that you're giving your audience a space where they feel valued, and the comment section just doesn't do that very often. So this is the question that's been driving the work Harkin has been doing. What would this look like in practice, in newsrooms? So this is just kind of a refresher. This is what the traditional journalism story cycle looks like, with the newsroom on top driving the entire process, and the public essentially non-existent in the process until post-publication. And here is the formula that Harkin's founder, Jen Brandel, came up with. She says, let the public in at the very beginning, at the moment that the story cycle begins. Let them ask questions that they haven't seen covered in the news. And then those questions become story ideas or pitches that you can then use within your newsroom to drive your journalism. And people often ask us this, why questions? Why not more standard crowdsourcing? And this is why. So when I was a reporter, I talked about the magic question all the time to people. It was a question that I knew that I could find on even the most difficult interview that would pull that source out of their kind of preconceived, calculated, prescriptive answers and get at something that was more real. Focusing on that question and having that kind of conversation with a source helped me keep two things in mind. It helped me keep very focused on that person and what they were actually telling me, and it helped me focus on my audience because I knew that what I wanted to bring them wasn't the sort of standard jargon-filled response that I might normally get from an official or from somebody, and I covered courts and crime, so I spent a lot of time talking to people about very difficult subjects, and it was often really hard to get people to give me something that felt authentic. So by focusing in on finding things that brought those moments of authenticity from my sources helped me keep that focus on my audience too, because that was what I was most interested in sharing with my community. This is from a piece that Jason Fried wrote in 2012 at Signal v. Noise called What Are Questions? And in this quote, he paraphrases something that he heard from Clayton Christensen, a Harvard Business School professor and author. And I really like this because I feel like it points to the exact thing that we all need to talk about. What question does your organization need to be asking? And taken another way, what answer are you making space for with this question? You're pointing to this. This is the space you want to open up within your newsroom. You want to open up space for things that your audience actually wants to know. And how do you know what they want to know? You've got to ask them a question like this. So this is exactly what Harkin kind of helps newsrooms do all around the world. And it's amazing what happens when that question gets asked to your communities. Because everybody has something that they want to know. These are some of the people that have asked questions of Harkin newsrooms over the years, and their questions have been answered, and it leads to this really amazing relationship and different way of doing things for those communities. All stories begin with an answer a question, even if it's not explicitly stated, and even if the question is as simple as what happened yesterday with the Chinese economy, or who won the football game, or what's the weather going to be this weekend. So here are some things that we've learned from experimenting with the public asking questions. Harkin started as an experimental news series at WBEZ, a radio station in Chicago. It's still going, and the series and similar series with Harkin are now in 100 plus newsrooms around the world. There's an audio clip that's going to play next, I think.
When were what schools?
Who decides what the next?
Where's that story?
Why they keep the loop?
What is this?
It's Curious City.
Where WBEZ answers your questions
About Chicago, the region, and its people.
I think that Curious City has been going for about 4+ years, and they've answered hundreds and hundreds of questions from their community. And some of these stories are deep and insightful, and some of them are funny and goofy. And here's some of what we've learned at Curious City and elsewhere. This is very true. If you're worried that this is the only thing your audience wants, they want more than that. Because this is very true too. These are some of the great questions that our partner newsrooms have answered from around the world. These are all real questions that came from community members, and they fit neatly into areas that you're already covering, like politics, global affairs, healthcare, but especially when you go back to that person who asked the question and find out why they want to know this, you get something special. It sets your coverage apart from anybody else who might be covering that topic, because you have a person you can use as an entry point, a protagonist even in some cases. They also ask questions that are not so newsy, but they have really great value. Here's a few examples of those non-newsy questions that we've seen come in. We see questions all around the world about the way people live their lives every day. So their commute, their language, they've got questions about demographics and human behavior, and these questions can lead to stories that are really distinctive and surprising, and they bring new texture to reporting, and they help your newsroom understand your community in a different way. The last newsroom that I was in, I was one of just a couple of people in the newsroom who hadn't grown up in the city that I was covering. And there were times when I was like, what's up with this thing? And they all looked at me like, everybody knows what's up with that thing. We don't need to write about that. And there had also been this huge influx of new people moving to that community from outside. And I had to really fight with them sometimes to make sure that they understood not everybody has your life experience, and we have to make space for these stories about why this city works the way that it does. So if you don't create space for these questions to come in and those knowledge gaps to be exposed to your newsroom so that you can fill them, you don't get this stream of fresh story ideas from your public. So we also want to talk about this. What if you give the public the opportunity to help assign stories? So not just say, I think this is a question that you should help me answer, but helping you choose which question to take on next. And that's the second spot in the public-powered story cycle. So let's see how that works. So with Harkin, we opened up a voting embed. This is one at one of our partners in Germany. This is an embed that they used recently to try to figure out what their audience wants. It's a way to put 3 questions or so up to your audience and see which one they like the best. Once the voting period is over, the newsroom understands what the most interest was in reporting out those answers, and then is able to assign that to a reporter and make the story happen. This opens you up to some new possibilities, things that you wouldn't have necessarily thought of on your own, and things that you may not have chosen from a news judgment standpoint. You can actually offer that up to your audience and say, which of these 3 questions about transportation and roads do you most want us to answer, and see what they say. You also get some opportunities for some really great marketing to happen, because sometimes these people who ask the questions are really invested in getting an answer. This is Sarah Lynn. She was a Curious City listener in Chicago, and she asked a question about the Chicago accent. And she was incredibly motivated to have her question answered. So she went on Twitter over and over and over again and asked her friends and her family and everybody who followed her to go to Curious City and vote for her question. Her question won, which is really great for Sarah Lynn. She ended up driving, her question drove a couple different pieces of journalism, and we'll get back to those in a little bit. But the next step in the Harkin public-powered process, so you've got the asking questions to get your story ideas, you've got voting to help them assign stories. What happens if you let them in on the reporting phase, the production phase? we are not kidding about that either. Like, we see people do that all of the time, and it leads to some wonderful experiences for the reporters and for the people who are asking these questions. This is a Curious City question asker along with a reporter on a story. And so when you bring your audience member with you, you're getting on-the-spot, in-the-field user testing. You get immediate feedback. You understand whether or not you're meeting their needs, if you're filling that information gap, or if you're maybe asking the wrong questions. They can bring their own questions to that interview too, and if they have things that come up that they want a follow-up question on, they can do that. Sometimes if they don't understand the jargon that an official is using in answer to a question, they can ask and say, what does that phrase mean? Explain this acronym to me. I've never heard that before. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some specific examples. So one place that we saw recently, a radio station in North Carolina, had a person who asked a question about an underground bunker that he'd heard was in town. So he asked this question, they chose it, and the reporter was able to line up a tour of this space and got the question asker able to come along. That guy would never have been able to get a tour of that place on his own. He only was able to get access to that spot because of his question that came in and was chosen by this news organization. Another reporter brought a question asker along on an interview with law enforcement officials to talk about a vehicle registration enforcement issue. They wanted to know if it was tax fraud because people were apparently going across the state line where the taxes were lower to register their vehicles and then coming back and driving them around in their other state. And that person was able to sit down with somebody from the law enforcement agency and ask their own questions and listen to that interview, see how the journalism gets made, see how reporters do their jobs and ask those questions of their sources. And then one of our most recent examples of this that I just really love, somebody in St. Louis asked what happens when animals at the zoo die. So this question got chosen and they went on this interview, and there's this photograph with the story of the reporter sitting in the middle with two microphones like this. One microphone to the zoo official and one microphone to the question asker. She didn't even have a microphone to herself at this moment. She was just providing an opportunity for this person who was so interested in what happened with zoo animals at the zoo to talk directly to the zoo officials. And then both of those voices were present in her story. She was as well. She was able to ask all the normal questions that she would want to ask in the production of a story. But she opened up this opportunity for somebody from the community who was very curious to have this interaction take place. All of these things combined lead to stories that are original, that you already know your audience wants and will find relevant, and they're often going to be very popular. Journalists are always searching for this kind of holy grail breakout story, and consistently finding them is difficult. So your audience's attention to work is what makes things popular and land in that space, which is why we say that you need to bring them in early in your planning process. They need to be present from the beginning if you want them to be this excited about things at the end. So we're going to jump back to Sarah Lynn's question for a minute. Her question about the Chicago accent inspired 3 of these kinds of holy grail breakout stories, and it got tons of response from the audience. All of these stats here are what they found with the stories that Sarah Lynn's question led to. They had 11 times more page views, they had an incredible time on the site, and far more comments and productive comments than average. And these metrics are repeated at many of our outlets. We see these kinds of things happening. These are often, we call them evergreen stories. They kind of live on even after your initial publication because they deal with something that doesn't go away. It's about how a community functions, maybe some local history, and it explains things that people often have questions about. Just kind of go through a couple of stats for you on some of these things so you can see how people are responding. WBEZ's Curious City, and then Bubbler Talk is a public-powered journalism process at my home public radio station in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. These 2 stations also found that their Harkin-powered, public-powered work were the top stories on their websites of all time. The Milwaukee station, I think their project is about 18 months to 2 years old. So out of all of their stories in the history of their station, a Bubbler Talk piece is the top story they've ever seen. The same thing is true for WBEZ in Chicago, which is a huge station and produces tons of content. A Curious City piece is their top story. This is something else that we see, that this tends to engage a different part of your community than your normal audience maybe. And in the United States, our public radio stations and our public television stations have to go to the community directly and ask for money. So this is Vermont Public Radio. They run a public-powered journalism project called Brave Little State. They had a particular targeted fundraising effort around just that program, and they found that 10% of the money they raised in that fund drive came from that promotion, and there were 171 people who had never donated to the station before who were willing to pay money at this particular moment to help be with that. So here's a quick recap on some of the things that are different. Your story cycle, with the newsroom on top, we say bring the public up and correct that flaw where they don't get to be involved until the very end. So this was our big question. Can this work anywhere? Can it work everywhere? And we've seen that it can. We've got more than 100 stations and newspapers that use us throughout the world, and we're thrilled to see the different kinds of community engagement that's happening within these partner newsrooms. We work for every format and in every style of story. These are some of the stories that we've seen people produce. And like I'd said before, some of these are kind of traditional feeling news stories on economics and local history stuff comes in there. I love the one on what would really happen if a tsunami hit San Francisco. Like, who in San Francisco doesn't worry about that sometimes? But is anybody ever going to just tell them the answer to this? Probably not. It's not something that would come up in your normal story planning cycle. So this was a way for them to really fill a need that their audience members have that they may not have come up with on their own within that newsroom. Stories will perform well. They also win a bunch of awards, usually. Every time that they do the regional awards in the United States, they just did those a couple weeks back. We see Harkin stories and Harkin stations kind of right in there because they're able to bring this kind of new approach to storytelling that comes in and brings their audience members in from the very beginning. They stand out. This is the way that we work. So there's the Harkin Platform and this kind of public-powered model. We also have public-facing pieces, which you'll see on the bottom, and then there's a back-end system that lets people in the newsroom manage all the engagement that comes in. So you can figure out what's going on, identify trends and themes, and be able to really let that stuff kind of percolate throughout your newsroom and make sure that you're using it in the best and most effective ways possible. I'm going to just walk through one story for you guys, just so you can see a way that this works in real life. The public-powered process, kind of start to finish, with Olivia Allen-Price. She's a reporter at KQED in San Francisco, and she runs their Harkin project called Bay Curious. So this is Olivia at work, looking like many of you probably do. You know, that's what I often looked like when I was in a newsroom. So to cultivate story ideas, Olivia puts the Harkin embeds on her site. This is their submission embed where they're asking people what they want to know about the Bay Area. People are submitting questions through this all the time. And this guy right here, Eric, is one of their listeners who sent in a question. He lives in San Francisco's Mission District, and he noticed that every Sunday, the streets were lined with double-parked cars, but he didn't understand why nobody enforced the rules around those. So he asked that. He could ask it in a bunch of other different places. He could go to a local Facebook group and put it in there. He could go onto something like Quora or Yahoo Answers and ask for this question to be there. But he took it to KQED. He's heard their promotions about Bay Area or Bay Curious and felt like that would be the best place to bring this. Olivia sees that question come in, and she thinks it would be a great story. So she puts it up for a vote because she wants to make sure before she spends her time on that story that her audience agrees and also thinks that it would be a great story. So she puts it up for a vote, and Eric rallies his friends to vote. His question wins, and Olivia understands going into this that there are people who really want to know this answer. So she starts working on the piece, is able to talk to Eric, find out why he wants to know this, and she's able to go back to him at the end of the story and ask him and tell him what she found out and see what he thinks about the answer. So her story kind of pulls him back in at the very end of this, and you get his reaction in the story too. I believe that his reaction was, maybe I'll double park on Sundays when I have errands to run because I understand I'm likely to not get a ticket. It was pretty funny. And just like the story we talked about before with Sarah Lynn's question about the Chicago accent, this story also performed very well. So your Harkin-powered stories live in the middle of this Venn diagram where you're getting to understand your audience in a different way, you're getting original and popular content, and you're getting lead generation and data and insight about your audience. They are voluntarily participating in this. You're not being sneaky and grabbing things without anybody's permission. You're asking them if you can contact them afterward. They are voluntarily sharing email addresses. You can ask them for phone numbers if you'd like. You're able to kind of ask them to participate in whatever way is best, and then they get to choose what they want to share and how to share it. This isn't about replacing any of the traditional journalism ways of doing things. So your reactive stories where something happens and you just know you've got to go out and cover that. Things that you determine internally are important for your community and that you really want to make sure that you report on, those still exist. We just want to add this third one, something where you're actually able to interact with and respond to your audience in this authentic way. It's about process and not about product. So you can use this in any format that you would like. This is the hard part. It's a very different way of doing things for you as a journalist, for your reporters, for management, and for your community. They're not particularly used to people coming to them from a news organization and saying, what do you want us to report on? Have you guys ever had a news organization that you follow come up to you as an audience member and say, what should we do next? Do you guys have any ideas? As reporters and journalists, we get to be part of those discussions, but as audience members, we typically aren't. So this is something that you have to work with and train your audience so that they believe you. And that's one of the reasons why we think that bringing them along throughout the process is so important. You're able to show them going forward that you're serious about this, that you're taking their input and you're really using it, that it does something going forward. It's not just a one-time thing. This is the way that we kind of see the audience traditionally, that they are consuming your product. It's not really a relationship. It's very extractive. We want to make this, move from this to something that is relational, something where you are engaging and it's back and forth, that you're taking something from them and offering something in return. This is putting the public at the center of your model, and you're going to see different values come off of that. So here's some things that can happen for newsrooms that are able to work with their public. They can see some pretty nice impacts coming off of that. And for your public, they get benefits as well. This person you'll see on the far right, she was a Curious City listener who had asked a question about fracking. And they were not able to really find a good answer because the information that she was looking for was kind of hidden and nobody could answer it. It just was not available. She was so motivated by that she changed her career. She left the job she had and she became an energy advocate, and that's what she does now. On the left there's I think I can't see, I've got it up here too. So on the left, there was a question that came in Nashville about the name of a public park. It was called Fred Douglass Park. It was in an African-American part of the community, and someone had asked, is that supposed to be named after Frederick Douglass, the famous abolitionist? And so the radio station was like, I don't know, let's find out. So they looked into it, and it turned out that it should have been, and that at the time that the park was given that name, it was sort of a slight by the city council at the time, and they were gonna just misspell the guy's last name and say Fred instead of Frederick, and just be very quiet about it, so nobody would know that they had named this park after someone who'd been a civil rights leader, many, many years before. And they changed the name of the park. They brought in a Frederick Douglass reenactor to be present at the renaming ceremony, and the park is now named Frederick Douglass Park so that it honors that tradition the way that it was supposed to be done. But that's a question that nobody had ever asked before, and the newsroom was able to take that and turn it into this thing that impacted the community in this way. It also helps earn trust back, and I talked about that a little bit before. People don't usually understand how journalism is done. It's kind of a black box. Stuff happens in your community, the newsroom takes it and does stuff with it, and then it comes out in broadcast, on the radio, on TV, on websites, in newspapers, but nobody's there to see the questions get asked unless it's at a press conference that's being broadcast. Nobody's there during the fact-checking process, the writing process, the filming and editing, all of those steps that we have to do, and we all know so intimately. Your audience just doesn't know that they exist often. So this way of opening things up and letting them see some more of that process and letting them have influence on it can help them trust you a bit more. This is something that we're dealing with a lot in the United States right now, is the sense that media aren't serving the public, and we want to really try to help change that. So these are a couple of slides here that talks about the public traditionally, and then what happens with an empowered public, and some of the things that are shifting for your public, but then also for you when this is something that you're able to do. So how do you know that the stories that you report are relevant? You've got to ask first and really listen. So I think we've got time now to take some questions if anybody has some, and then after that, if there's time, we've got a little bit of a kind of participation activity. So Carla, you want to come out and help me with this part?
Okay. And we have a nice thrower in front. So is maybe Mr. Tim Toot here in the audience? Is he? Oh, okay, class, go for it. Oh. Maybe you can help out again. The reason why I asked for you because this guy is from the Netherlands as well. He works for RTV West, in the west of the Netherlands. And at his station, they've been using the Harkin model. So are you a happy customer?
Yes, I am.
Yay!
Hey!
I didn't tell him to say this. I've never met Tim, right?
No, never
Before, so.
So how do you use the system?
Like she told. And what I see is she's true, because we make stories we never thought about, and I think that's the beauty of it.
Can you give us an example of a story you made using this method?
Yes, several. We have the whole Vijver. It's a place where the government is, and someone asked us what kind of fish is swimming over there, and we never do stories like that, and so we thought, yes, we're going to do it, and it got hundreds of thousands of views on Facebook, for example.
That could actually be a national story, because everybody sees that pond in front of our parliament. So what fish do swim there?
It's a lot of trash.
Okay.
But it's not fish, it is everything. And another story, there was a supermarket, and there was a fire 5 years ago, and the supermarket in that village was gone and never came back. So someone from that village asked us, why isn't there a supermarket? And no one answered that question ever before. So on the front row, there's Mark and Katinka, and we are spitting into it, and we made a story, and I think it was refreshing for everyone.
Okay, thank you,
So that
Tim.
was clear. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim. So is there anyone else in the audience who has a question for Janine? Raise your hand. Up here in front.
Here, catch.
Okay. Stand up, catch. Oh, this is not an easy thing to use, but it sort of gets you all together and help each other out.
My name is Mark Cole. I'm also from TV West, a colleague of Tim, and I'm the reporter who making stories about Harkin. I recognize the story you tell, and I think the power of Harkin is that people want to be take serious. And I often hear when I'm making this kind of stories, and I talk with those people, and I have a lot of contact with them, because during the whole process you inform them, you tell what you're going to do. Sometimes they're going with you on report. And after you made a story, you often hear from finally a journalist who is listening to me and who take my questions serious. So I think that's really a powerful thing about Harkin. But I also have some things that I think you really have to think over. For example, not always the questions you get are really relevant. There's a lot of people who's asking a question, why there are so many Polish people in Den Haag. Why the government, why our mayor is still there because he's really bad. So you really have to, when we started, we had the idea that always you have to take the audience serious. Every question you have to answer, always you have to do something with it. And during the process, we find out that that's not...
No, every question is useful. No, so how do you go about shifting?
Sometimes it's about promotion, so making sure that your audience understands the kinds of question you want. So there's ways that we work with newsrooms to figure out how they're going to market their series, what channels they're going to use for it, whether it's on-air promotion, stories on their website, going out in public at an event and having like a box or a laptop or a tablet where people can come up and you can say, this is what I'm doing, this is why I'm doing it, do you have a question? And you can ask it here and we'll answer it later. Sometimes people ask questions that that are junky, and that's just because sometimes people are trolls and they take to your comment box and your question box as trolls. But there are also times that we've seen a couple of organizations take these questions that on the face feel like they're not ones you want to answer, and they contact this person and say, you asked why the mayor has been in office even though he does a bad job. Talk to me more about this question. You could find out, why do they think the mayor is doing such a bad job? You could find out, maybe they don't understand how to be involved. Maybe it can lead to a story about the lack of political participation in elections locally. So sometimes these junky questions are junky on the surface, and if you can talk with somebody and find out more about what they're asking and why they want to know this, it can turn into something that's a lot more interesting. There was a newspaper in Austin, Texas, that had somebody ask a question about who cleans up the debris in the road after an accident. That's the kind of thing that, it would be like a 3-inch brief on like a back page when there's an ad stack that looks funny and you just need to fill a hole. Like that kind of a brief about who to call if you need to clean something up in the roadway would not usually be something that we'd spend reporter time on in a newspaper. But because this came in through their Harkin project, they contacted this person. They found out that she wanted to know this because her commute was super delayed one day because of this crash that left all of this debris in the road. And she was really curious, like, who does that? If I were to be in a crash, would I have to clean up the debris from my own accident? She didn't understand, and she didn't know who to call about it. So the newspaper checked it out, found out that she would need to call the number 511, this kind of community helpline, and that they would then send somebody out to clean it up. They called her back up and said, hey, we found out you call 511. Does this make you happy? And she's like, yes, I feel so great about this. And then it turned into a 10 to 12-inch story that they were able to put out and was useful for people and helped people understand this information and why it's important in a different way than a brief might have. So sometimes it takes a little bit of vulnerability on your part and being open to somebody telling you something that you might not have thought about and taking them a little bit more seriously than you normally would to see what they have to offer. We've seen news organizations sometimes answer questions about, like, why are you such a liberal publication? And then they're like, oh, why don't you join us for a meeting where we talk about things and you can see how we make decisions. Sometimes you'll get questions about, I think it was a radio station in California. They had a bunch of protests a couple months back, and they were using a specific phrase to refer to the kind of political leanings of one of the groups that was doing a lot of the protests. And there's like 3 different terms that people can use for these groups. And this person wrote in and was like, why don't you call them this? And the news station was like, we should probably use this as an opportunity to explain the language that we're using and why we're using it. So they did this story that said, we had somebody ask us why we are calling these people with this name and not this name or this other name. It was, I can't remember the terms, which is why I'm being a little bit vague, but it was kind of the alt-right, like conservative white supremacist rallies that were happening in the United States a couple months back. And they explained this, and they used information from the Associated Press to explain, like, why they did things in a certain way. They said why they don't use certain terms. And that was how they treated that question. And it opened up their process to their entire audience and let them have this honest discussion and let people see this wasn't something driven by an internal bias within the news organization. It was really driven by this need to be as accurate and anti-inflammatory as possible, but still accurate with what was really going on.
Okay. Well, you're lucky. You don't have to throw the ball. You can just give it to the lady behind you, because she has a question as well.
Yes, I do. Thank you for a very interesting speech. I think it was, I feel really, really lucky to hear about your project. I was wondering, how do you make sure no organization or politicians take advantage of the voting part? If I noticed you had a question saying, what's keeping the Sunshine State from using more solar power? If I was a politician really strong on the green environmental part, I would definitely make sure somebody asked you that question.
We have that happen sometimes. There have been a couple of news organizations that have received questions, and then they find out later that, or kind of during the process, that if a lobbying organization tells people to ask a question, all of those questions tend to look very similar. So if all of a sudden you get 50 questions that are some variation on why isn't there more solar power in the Sunshine State, the newsroom has a pretty good idea that this was some kind of effort from some group. But we don't necessarily see that as a complete barrier to doing the story. If it's still a good question, and if it's something that you think would be relevant to your community, you can still report the story and be honest about it. And then we've seen places say, this is a question that came in. It was obviously from a lobbying group because we got 50 versions of this same question, but we still think that it's an important thing for you guys to understand. So here's the answer. And having that transparency around it really helps people understand. It's, and I feel like that's a much more honest way to treat it than to kind of report on that story and not say why you're doing it. If somebody throws a press conference and you go, inside the industry, we understand that this was something driven by this organization. Somebody throws a press conference to say, we're going to unveil $1 million in subsidies to help businesses put solar panels on their business building. That is just as much, and coverage of that press conference is going to happen, and we're never going to say to people, this is a press conference. People only throw press conferences when they want to tell you something good about their own organization. So when a question comes in that you know is driven by a lobbyist or somebody with a special interest and you're honest about it, it's actually it's a different way of being open and kind of making sure that your process is fully understood by your audience. As far as the voting goes, we have voting fraud kind of detectors, and so if the same IP address votes more times than is good, it gets flagged, and there's ways to delete those votes or to accept them. It doesn't happen super often, but it does happen sometimes, and then the news organization gets to choose whether they want to accept that, that batch of votes or if they want to delete those from the round so that it clears that out.
Perhaps I can give from our experience also some answer on this, because we had local elections in the Netherlands, and we noticed then that a lot of political people in our area had questions about issues of their own program they want to have an answer on. So they want to have their own issues broadcast. So you really have to be careful about that kind of things. You're right.
We see people do a lot of work around elections all around the world. Australia does a ton of work with elections through their Harkin projects, and in the United States, we're seeing a lot of folks do more with that. One of our partners in Alabama recently collected questions for 2 different gubernatorial forums that they were holding, and they took questions from the audience, gave those people VIP tickets to attend, and then asked those questions as part of the forum that they were holding for these candidates. KPCC in California is using Harkin to collect questions about the voting process, and then they have a person they call the human voting guide who is answering all these questions about, like, how do I vote? How do I make sure I have my registration correct? What does it mean if I do this on my ballot? And they're using it to kind of help ensure that people are able to vote and understand the process of going to the polls that day.
Okay, we have time for one last question before we go on a coffee break.
Hello. I only pop in with a little production side question. That means that from the very beginning of answering the questions and establishing what it's going to be treated, how long does this process go to, from the very beginning to a sort of an output? And also the output, is it only then on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever, or also does it come with a report on television, or could you tell us something about that? Thank you.
The answer for how long it takes is it depends. Sometimes you'll get questions that are very timely that you want to turn around very quickly, and you might reach out to the question asker and tell them, get back to me in the next 3 hours and I'll talk with you about this, but otherwise I'm just going to answer the story and it's going to be produced for this evening's newscast or for tomorrow's paper. So it can be a very short cycle. It can also extend. We have some questions that are, they lead to giant investigations that take months, and that's no different than any idea that might come up. So it's really driven by a combination of things with what the question is and how much it takes to answer that, but also within your news organization, kind of how much of an impact it's going to have on the story if you are able to get the question asker involved versus if it's one where you might just choose to answer it even if they can't be present for it. And there's no, we don't ever say that you need the question asker to be involved. So if they choose to not participate, you're still able to report their question because they've offered that. And if you choose that it's one you want to pursue, you can do that without their help on that side of things if needed. And then the second half of your question was about where things were published. So you publish them the way you would any story that you would do. So if you're a television station, you can put it out on your broadcast channels and then promote that the way you would promote any work. If you're a newspaper, you can make it for web and for print. I was at a newspaper running a Harkin project here, and those stories ran often on the kind of lifestyle or feature front or on the front page of the paper, depending on the story that we were producing. So they went in our normal publication channel, and then we would promote them online and on social the way we would any other piece. And then just last, I have a couple things up at the front here, and I'll have these with me today. So if anybody wants them, one is a sheet with information about Harkin, and the other one is this, it's an engagement checklist, and it's meant as a sort of really quick worksheet for you to use to start to think about the way that you are engaging with your audience and some ideas on how you might want to shift that. I'm going to just grab that really quick if I have time for that, Carl.
They're over there, the leaflets. You can take them if you want to.
So they're here. I'll leave them here for a bit, and then I'll just have them in my bag. So feel free to flag me if you would like one. But these, the questions that are on here are how and where are you creating opportunities for participation from your audience? How and where are you thanking and acknowledging their participation? How often and where are you letting people know that they can participate? And how public participation actually influences your work? Things like that. Just ways to really think about this in a different way beyond just what the metrics are that you might be measuring things with, but to think about what this looks like to your audience as well.
Okay.
So that's
Thank
all
you
I've
so
got.
much, Janine.
Thank you guys very much.